The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Prairie like a hammer. It was not a season that arrived with gentle hints of frost on the grass or a picturesque dusting of snow. It was a declaration of war. The sky, once a vast and hopeful blue, turned to a sheet of hammered pewter, low and heavy, pressing the very air from the lungs. The wind was not a whisper through the pines. It was a blade, honed on the glaciers of the north, and it came to cut. It scoured the land, stripping away the last vestiges of autumn's brittle warmth, and leaving behind a cold so profound it felt like the world's final truth. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the chinking of the log cabins, flowed under the ill-fitting doors, and breathed its icy vapor through the single panes of glass. It was a thief that stole the heat from a hearth almost as fast as a fire could be fed. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence, the people fought this war with the only weapons they knew: wood and fire. The ring of the axe was the town's heartbeat, a frantic, desperate rhythm that echoed from dawn until the last light failed. Men, their faces wrapped in wool until only their weary eyes were visible, spent their days in the dwindling stands of cottonwood along the creek, felling trees, bucking logs, and hauling them back on crude stone boats. Their labor was immense, a testament to their will to survive, but it was a battle they were losing. The woodpiles, which had seemed like fortresses of fuel in October, were shrinking with alarming speed. Each log tossed into a stove seemed to vanish into heat that was immediately devoured by the insatiable cold. The cabins, built in the proud tradition of the eastern forests they had left behind, were proving to be tragically unsuited for this open, wind-swearing land. They were boxes of wood, standing tall against the sky, offering their walls as a challenge to the wind. It was a challenge the wind always won. Inside these cabins, life had been reduced to a small circle of habitable space around the stove. Frost bloomed on the interior walls, intricate patterns of ice that grew thicker by the day, a beautiful and deadly garden. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The children were always cold, their faces pinched and pale. The old ones coughed, a dry, rattling sound that spoke of lungs chilled to their core. This was the universal struggle of Providence. It was not a problem of one family's poor planning or another's lazy acts. It was a systemic failure. They had brought their knowledge with them from a different world, a world of deep woods and gentler winters, and they were trying to force that knowledge upon a land that refused to accept it. They built as their fathers had built, because it was the only way they knew. And so they all suffered together, united in a tradition that was failing them all. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever the summer before, leaving her with two small children, a boy named Caleb and a girl named Sophie. In a community that valued family units and the strength of a man's back, she was an object of pity and a quiet concern. She was an outsider in more ways than one. She had come with her husband from a land across the sea, a place of green hills and ancient stones, but her own people came from the wind-swept steppes of the east, a place where the earth and the sky were locked in an eternal struggle, much like this one. She was quiet, with eyes that seemed to see the world in a different way. While others saw the wind as an enemy to be fought, she saw it as a river to be diverted. While others saw the snow as a burden to be shoveled, she saw it as a blanket to be used. She watched the men of the settlement build their tall, drafty cabins, and she saw the flaw in their design with a clarity that felt like an old, inherited memory. They were fighting the prairie. She knew you could not fight the prairie. You had to ask for its shelter. One morning, as the men gathered to plan the reinforcement of a neighbor's roof, Ilara approached them. Her presence caused a brief, awkward silence. She was not one to speak in the company of men. She held a stick in her hand, and in the frozen dirt she drew a shape. It was not a square. It was a long rectangle, and beside it she drew a cross-section. It showed walls of unusual thickness, and a roof that was not peaked and shingled, but low and gently sloped. "The house should not stand against the wind," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It should bend before it. And the roof should be made of the earth itself." She looked up at them, her gaze steady. A sod roof, thick, heavy, to hold the warmth in and keep the cold out. The men stared at the drawing, then at her. A moment of confused silence was broken by a short, sharp laugh from Thomas, the settlement's most respected builder. He was a large man, confident in his craft, a man who had built nearly every structure in Providence. He saw himself as a guardian of the proper way of doing things. "A roof of dirt?" he scoffed, and the other men chuckled along with him, relieved. "Woman, the first rain will turn your house to mud. The first heavy snow will crush it like an egg." He kicked a bit of frozen earth over her drawing, erasing it. "You're building a grave, not a home. Stick to your sewing and leave the building to men who understand timber." The others murmured in agreement. It was foolishness. Everyone knew a good roof was made of cedar shingles, tightly laid on a steep pitch to shed the snow. A roof of sod was something an animal might live under. The idea was absurd, a sign of a mind addled by grief and loneliness. They warned her against such folly, telling her she would be endangering her children with such a reckless experiment. Elara did not argue. She had not expected them to understand. Their knowledge was written in books and passed down from masters who had never felt a wind that could strip flesh from bone. Her knowledge was older, written in the earth itself, passed down through generations who had learned to survive by becoming part of the landscape, not by trying to conquer it. She nodded quietly, picked up her stick, and walked away from their circle of laughter and dismissal. Their mockery was a cold thing, but it was nothing compared to the cold that was coming. She had her husband's small savings, a strong back, and a memory of her grandmother's house, a low, warm burrow that had stood for 100 years against the wrath of the steppe winds. She would not build a grave. She would build a sanctuary. Her children's lives depended on it. Her work began the next day. She chose a spot on her small plot of land behind her existing, failing cabin. It was on a slight rise, but she chose the leeward side, where the land itself offered a natural break against the prevailing northwesterly winds. She did not start by raising walls. She started by going down. With a spade and a wheelbarrow, she excavated a shallow pit about 2 feet deep. The work was brutal. The top layer of soil was frozen solid, and she had to use a pickaxe to break it apart, her small frame jolting with every swing. The men of the settlement would pass by on their way to the woods, and they would see her there, a lone woman toiling in a frozen hole in the ground. They would shake their heads, whispering to each other about the poor widow who had finally lost her senses. The women watched from their windows, their hearts torn between pity for her apparent madness and a grudging respect for her sheer tenacity. Once the pit was dug, she laid the foundation, not of cut stone, which she could not afford or move, but of large, flat river rocks she gathered from the creek bed. She hauled them one by one in her wheelbarrow, her muscles screaming in protest. She laid them with meticulous care, creating a solid, level base that would not heave when the ground froze and thawed. This was the anchor of the house, the part that connected it to the unyielding stability of the deep earth. While she worked, the sounds of Providence carried on around her. The sharp, confident blows of Thomas's hammer rang out as he and his crew worked to finish another new cabin before the first big snow. Theirs was a work of speed and visible progress. Walls rose quickly, a skeleton of logs that was soon fleshed out. They worked with the easy camaraderie of shared knowledge, their movements efficient and practiced. Their work was loud and proud. Ilara's work was quiet, solitary, and slow. It was a meditation in physical form. After the foundation, she began the most arduous task, cutting the sod. The prairie was a sea of dormant grass, its root systems woven into a dense, tangled mat that had been undisturbed for centuries. This was the material she would use for her walls. She had a special tool for it, one her husband had forged for her based on a design from her memory. It was a sod cutter, a sharp steel spade with a wing on one side to slice the bricks to a uniform thickness. She would drive it into the earth with her foot, cut a long strip, and then slice it into blocks, each one about 2 feet long, a foot wide, and 4 inches thick. Each block was heavy, dense with soil and roots. Lifting one was a strain. Lifting hundreds was a monumental act of will. She worked in a rhythm, cutting, lifting, stacking. Her hands, raw and blistered, were stained black with the rich soil. The wind tore at her, trying to steal the warmth from her body, but she kept moving, generating her own heat through relentless labor. She laid the sod bricks like a mason laying stone, grass side down, in overlapping courses. The walls rose slowly, not of wood that resisted the land, but of the land itself. They were incredibly thick, nearly 3 feet at the base. She left openings for a single door and 2 small windows, framing them with salvaged lumber. As she worked, she could see the other cabins of Providence, their thin log walls standing starkly against the horizon. They were objects placed upon the land. Her house was growing out of it. Thomas, passing by one afternoon, stopped and watched her for a long moment. He saw her struggle to lift a heavy sod brick into place. "That wall will never hold," he called out, his voice not entirely unkind, more like a teacher correcting a stubborn student. "It's just mud and grass. The first good soaking rain will wash it all away." Ilara paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of dirt. "The roots hold it together," she replied simply, "and the weight holds it down." He shook his head and walked on. He had offered his wisdom, and she had refused it. There was nothing more he could do. The structure of the roof was the most critical part. She laid thick cottonwood beams, salvaged from an old shed, across the top of the sod walls. On top of these, she placed a layer of smaller poles, and then, her one extravagance, a layer of canvas, tightly stretched and nailed down. Her grandmother had used birch bark, a material unavailable here, for waterproofing. Canvas was a poor substitute, but she hoped it would be enough. Over the canvas, she began to lay the sod bricks for the roof, starting from the edges and working her way to the center. This was the most dangerous and difficult part of the construction. She had to haul each heavy brick up a makeshift ramp and carefully position it. The weight on the beams was immense. This was the moment Thomas had predicted would bring disaster. The men who saw her working on the roof called out warnings, telling her she was going to bring the whole thing down on her head. She ignored them, her focus absolute. She knew the strength of her beams, and she knew the principle. The weight, properly distributed, created a powerful, stable arch. The final layer of sod was laid grass side up. In the spring, it would come alive, the green grass blending the house into the prairie until it was little more than a gentle swelling on the landscape. Inside, she plastered the walls with a mixture of clay and straw, creating a smooth, surprisingly beautiful surface that sealed every tiny gap. She built a small, efficient fireplace and chimney out of clay-mortared stones, with a flue designed with a gentle curve, a detail she remembered from the old country, designed to slow the escaping heat and radiate more of it back into the room. Her home was not a cabin, it was a den. It was a burrow. It was a part of the earth, protected by the immense thermal mass of its own walls and roof. When she was finally finished, just as the first serious snows began to fall, It was a humble and strange-looking thing. It barely rose 5 feet from the ground at the peak of its roof. It looked less like a house and more like a part of the natural terrain. The children, who had been living in the cold, drafty cabin, stepped inside for the first time. The air was still and quiet. The silence was the first thing they noticed. The howling of the wind was gone, replaced by a muted whisper. With just a small fire in the hearth, a gentle, pervasive warmth began to fill the single room. It was a warmth that felt different, steady, calm, and deep. The laughter of the community had faded, replaced by the silence of the coming winter. The test was about to begin. The great storm did not announce itself with theatrical thunder or dramatic flashes of lightning. It arrived as a deepening of the gray, a subtle but absolute shift in the texture of the sky. The air grew unnaturally still, a silence that was more ominous than any noise. The temperature plummeted, not by degrees, but by tens of degrees. A breath taken outside felt like swallowing shards of glass. Then the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the soft, fluffy flakes of a gentle winter's day. They were small and hard, like grains of sand, driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a shriek in the space of an hour. The winter of 1883 had been a hammer, but this storm was the final, crushing blow. It would be known for generations as the Great White Hurricane, a blizzard of such terrifying force that it would recalibrate the very meaning of the word winter for everyone who lived through it. Within hours, the world outside the windows of Providence vanished. There was no sky, no horizon, only a churning, blinding vortex of white. The wind did not blow, it attacked. It struck the tall, proud walls of the log cabins like a battering ram, seeking every crack, every seam, every weakness. The fine, granular snow was driven into the chinking, melting from the escaping heat of the cabins, then refreezing, expanding, and prying the logs apart. The sound was deafening, a constant, high-pitched scream that vibrated through the very timbers of the homes. It was a sound that frayed the nerves and made rational thought impossible. It was the sound of nature's fury, absolute and indifferent. The snow began to accumulate with terrifying speed. A foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. It was a dry, heavy snow that did not drift gracefully, but packed down into a dense, concrete-like mass. The weight on the shingled roofs of the settlement became a palpable threat. Inside Thomas's cabin, the fight for survival was becoming desperate. He, his wife, and their 3 children were huddled around the cast-iron stove, which glowed a dull red but seemed to be fighting a losing battle. The heat it produced was snatched away by the drafts that poured in from every direction. The wind howled in the chimney, sending puffs of smoke and ash back into the room. His wife was stuffing rags into the gaps that had opened up in the walls, but it was like trying to dam a river with pebbles. A loud crack echoed through the small home, and Thomas looked up to see a new fissure in one of the main roof beams. It was sagging, groaning under a weight it was never designed to bear. He had built this house with his own hands, with the best materials he could find, using every bit of knowledge passed down to him. And it was failing. He was feeding wood into the stove at a frantic pace, watching his precious woodpile, located just outside the door, disappear under the suffocating blanket of snow. Soon he would not even be able to get to it. Fear, cold and sharp, began to settle in his heart. It was a fear he had never known before, the fear of a craftsman who realizes his craft is worthless. The story was the same all across Providence. Families fought to keep their fires alive. The constant, thunderous roar of the wind was punctuated by the sharp, terrifying sounds of their homes breaking. Shingles were torn from roofs and sent spinning into the white abyss. In one cabin, a window pane, unable to withstand the pressure of the wind, imploded, showering the room with glass and letting in a furious blast of snow and cold that extinguished their fire in an instant. The family, screaming in terror, scrambled to board it up, but the damage was done. The cold had breached their fortress. The greatest terror came in the middle of the first night. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the storm, a sound that was felt as much as heard. It was the sound of a roof collapsing under the sheer tonnage of the snow. The sound of a home, a family's entire world, being obliterated. Panic spread like a contagion. The people of Providence were trapped in failing shelters, listening to the storm try to tear its way in, knowing that for one family, it already had. Meanwhile, in the small, low house burrowed into the prairie, there was quiet. Outside, the same wind shrieked, the same snow fell, but it met a different structure. The wind, unable to get a purchase on the low, sloping roof, flowed over it like water over a smooth stone. The house did not fight the wind. It yielded to it, presenting so little resistance that the storm's fury was spent on the empty air above. The snow, which was a crushing weight on the other roofs, was a blessing here. It piled up on the sod, feet deep, burying the house until it was nothing more than a white mound. And with every inch of snow that fell, the house grew warmer. The snow was a perfect insulator, a thick, downy blanket provided by the storm itself. The sod roof, with its immense thermal mass, held the day's heat, and the snow held the sod's heat, creating a sanctuary of profound and steady warmth. Inside, Elara sat with her children. A small, calm fire flickered in the hearth, consuming wood at a slow, almost leisurely pace. Her stockpile, safely stored in a small alcove by the door, was barely diminished. The temperature in the single room was even and comfortable. There were no drafts. The only sound from the outside world was a deep, low hum, the muffled voice of a giant storm raging miles away, not feet from their heads. Caleb and Sophie were not huddled in fear. They were playing quietly on a braided rug in the center of the floor. The warmth was so complete, so secure, that they felt no threat. Elara looked at them, at the peace on their faces, and she felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. Her memory had served her well. The old ways, the quiet wisdom of her ancestors, had held true. Her home was not a grave, it was an ark, floating on a sea of white, keeping her precious cargo safe while the world outside was torn apart. She was not a fool, she was a survivor. The storm raged for 2 full days and nights. On the third morning, the wind finally began to subside, its furious shriek diminishing to a mournful moan. The snowfall lessened, and then, at last, it stopped. A strange, brilliant light filled the world as the sun struck the unbroken expanse of new snow. The silence that followed the storm was as profound as the noise had been. It was a world transformed, buried. In Providence, the people began to emerge from their battered homes like creatures from a long hibernation. The sight that greeted them was one of devastation. Roofs had collapsed, walls were breached, and every structure bore the scars of the battle. The snow was 6 feet deep on the level, with drifts that rose to the eaves of the houses. The town looked broken, defeated. Thomas's cabin had survived, but barely. The main roof beam was cracked almost through, and he knew it had been a matter of hours, perhaps minutes, before it would have given way entirely. His family was safe, but they were frozen, exhausted, and terrified. His first thought was for his neighbors. He struggled to clear his doorway, a task that took nearly an hour of frantic shoveling. His second thought, a cold spike of guilt and dread, was for the widow. He remembered his own words, "You're building a grave." He pictured her small, strange house, buried under 6 feet of dense, heavy snow. He imagined the roof, made of just mud and grass, collapsing under the immense weight. He envisioned her and her children, trapped, crushed. The thought was unbearable. He had mocked her, dismissed her, and now he might be responsible for her death. Driven by a desperate need to know, he began to fight his way through the massive drifts toward her plot of land. Every step was a monumental effort, plunging him into snow up to his waist. When he finally reached her property, his heart sank. There was nothing there. Where her house should have been, there was only a smooth, white mound, indistinguishable from the rest of the snow-covered landscape. A small wisp of smoke, almost invisible against the white, curled lazily into the cold, still air from what looked like a small stone poking through the snow. It was the top of her chimney. He had been right. It was a grave. He scrambled onto the mound, his mind racing, and began to dig frantically with his bare hands at the place where he thought the door should be. The snow was packed and heavy. He shouted her name, his voice hoarse. "Elara, Elara, can you hear me?" He heard a muffled scraping sound from beneath his feet. Then, a section of the snow seemed to shift inward. A rectangle of wood was revealed, and it opened. Elara stood there, framed in the doorway, looking up at him from the top of 2 steps that led down into her home. She held a broom. Behind her, a soft yellow light glowed, and from the opening wafted a wave of warm, calm air that smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. It was an impossible warmth, a gentle, life-giving heat that felt like a memory of summer. She looked at him, her expression not of triumph or anger, but of simple, tired concern. "Thomas," she said, her voice even, "are you all right? Your family?" Thomas stared, speechless. He was standing on her roof, a roof that was holding not only his own considerable weight, but also the weight of 6 feet of solid snow. He looked from her calm face down into the warm, serene space behind her. He could see her children sitting at a small table, eating. They were not wrapped in blankets. They were in their normal clothes. The scene was one of utter, unbelievable peace. It was the absolute antithesis of the cold, chaotic terror he had just endured in his own home. All his certainty, all his pride in his craft, all the traditional wisdom he had held as gospel, shattered in that instant. He was wrong. He had been completely, utterly, and dangerously wrong. The cold air he was breathing felt sharp and thin, while the air flowing out of her home felt rich and alive. He stumbled back, sliding down the snowbank of her roof, landing in the deep drift below. He did not say anything. He couldn't. He simply turned and began the long, slow struggle back to his own home, his mind reeling. The stark contrast was a physical blow. His house, a proud log structure built with the best techniques he knew, was a frozen, broken shell. Her house, a humble mound of earth he had mocked, was a warm, impregnable fortress. It had not just survived the storm, it had used the storm as a shield. The snow that had been his enemy had been her ally. He arrived back at his cabin to find his wife trying to start a fire with frozen kindling, their children huddled together, shivering uncontrollably under a pile of blankets. The reality of his failure was so complete, so undeniable, that it left no room for pride. He looked at the cracked beam above his head, then at the faces of his cold, frightened family. There was only one thing to do. He gathered up his family and, without a word, led them back through the snow, following the trail he had just made. When he reached Elara's home again, he did not hesitate. He led his family down the 2 small steps and into the warmth. Ilara simply moved aside, gesturing to the far side of the room. "There is soup on the stove," she said quietly. "Sit. Rest." Her triumph was not in words. It was in the simple, undeniable fact of the warmth she offered. Word of the widow's warm house spread through the devastated settlement with the speed of a prairie fire. It began with Thomas's silent, stunned journey. Neighbors saw him leading his family through the deep snow and, following his tracks, discovered the source of the impossible curl of smoke. One by one, then in small groups, they came. They came from homes with collapsed roofs, from cabins where the fires had died and could not be relit, from shelters that were now colder inside than out. Each arrival was the same. They would appear at the top of the excavated doorway, their faces etched with desperation and disbelief, and they would be met by the gentle wave of steady, quiet warmth. Ilara's tiny, single-room home became a sanctuary. She took them all in. Families huddled together, sharing blankets and soup, the quiet hum of their conversation replacing the howl of the wind. There was no mockery now. There was only awe. The men, builders and farmers all, ran their hands over the smooth clay walls, touched the thick wooden beams of the ceiling, and stared at the small, efficient fire, trying to comprehend the principles at work. They looked at the woman they had dismissed as a fool, and they saw a prophet. After the last of the refugees had been settled and the storm had long passed, Thomas approached Ilara. The other men in the room fell silent, watching. He stood before her, a large, proud man made small by the events of the past few days. His face was a mask of humility. He did not offer excuses or apologies for his earlier dismissal. The proof of his error was all around them, in the warm, safe air they were all breathing. He simply looked at her, meeting her calm gaze, and said the two words that were the hardest for a man like him to say. "Teach me." It was not a request. It was a plea. It was the surrender of a lifetime of certainty, the admission that his knowledge was incomplete, and the beginning of a new education. It was the moment the entire community's mindset shifted. The old way had failed. A new way had been proven. The skeptic had become the first student. Ilara nodded. She did not remind him of his laughter or his insults. There was no need. The storm had provided a lesson more powerful than any words she could utter. She took a charred stick from the hearth, and, on the smooth clay floor of her home, she began to draw. She sketched the foundation, explaining how the river stones anchored the house to the earth's stability. She drew the thick, overlapping courses of the sod bricks, explaining how the dense root mat locked them together like 1,000 tiny fingers, and how the sheer mass of the walls stored the sun's warmth and the fire's heat. She drew the gentle slope of the roof, showing how it deflected the wind instead of fighting it. She explained the crucial importance of the waterproofing layer, and how the final layer of sod, grass side up, would eventually turn the house into a living part of the prairie. She shared her knowledge freely, holding nothing back. It was not her knowledge to hoard. It was the inherited wisdom of a people who had learned to listen to the land. The men of Providence, led by Thomas, gathered around her, no longer a chorus of doubt, but a classroom of eager pupils. They listened, and for the first time, they began to understand. When the great thaw of 1884 finally arrived, melting the mountains of snow and revealing a landscape scrubbed clean and ready for a new beginning, the settlement of Providence did not simply repair, it rebuilt. The sound of the axe and the hammer returned, but they were used in a new way. Under the quiet guidance of Ilara and the newly fervent direction of Thomas, the people began to construct new homes. They dug into the earth, laid foundations of stone, and cut the rich, dark sod from the prairie. The work was slow and arduous, far more difficult than throwing up a quick log cabin, but no one complained. They had learned the value of patience and diligence. They had learned that the easiest way was not always the safest way. The very landscape of the settlement began to change. Instead of tall, vulnerable boxes perched on the plains, low, solid structures began to rise from the ground, hugging the contours of the land. They were not monuments to man's defiance of nature, but testaments to his willingness to cooperate with it. The story of the widow's house and the Great White Hurricane became a local legend, but its impact spread far beyond the small community of Providence. Travelers, land surveyors, and new settlers passing through would stop and stare at the strange, green-roofed homes. They would hear the story of the storm, of the failed cabins, and the one small house that had used the blizzard as a blanket. Thomas, now Ilara's most devoted advocate, would take them inside, letting them feel the steady, cool air in the summer and the deep, abiding warmth in the winter. He would explain the principles with the passion of a convert. The idea, so simple and yet so revolutionary, began to spread. The design was copied, adapted, and improved upon in settlements all across the northern plains. The quiet wisdom of a lone woman, born of ancient necessity, became a new standard for survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. It was a legacy of humility, a quiet movement of sod and earth that saved countless lives in the winters that followed. Years later, when Providence was a thriving town and the great storm was a story told to wide-eyed grandchildren, Ilara would sit outside her home in the summer, her roof a riot of prairie wildflowers. Her own children were grown, living in sod houses of their own. She was no longer the foolish widow, but the quiet matriarch of the community, a source of wisdom sought by all. She never boasted of her vindication, never spoke of the mockery she had endured. She had learned a profound truth long ago, that the loudest voices are not always the wisest. True strength was not in standing tall and defiant against the storm, but in having the humility to bow before it, to find shelter in the earth, and to trust in knowledge that was patient, deep, and quiet. The greatest lesson Providence learned from the winter of 1883 was not how to build a better house, but how to listen. They learned to listen to the wind, to the snow, and to the quiet voice of a woman who understood that survival is not about conquering the world, but about finding your proper place within it.